Welcome to Nebraska Department of Education Nutrition Services webinar on meal modifications in the school meal programs. The first part of this webinar will consist of meal modification training, and the last part of the webinar will be a question and answer session. As you have questions, please type them into the chat box, and I will do my best to answer them at the end. You will need a Google account in order to use the chat box, so please be sure to log in order to use the chat box. If you do not have access, please be sure to write down your questions and contact me after the webinar. My name is Brittany Spieker, and I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition services program specialist. In this slide, you will find my email if you should ever need to contact me with meal modification requests. During this training, I will define several common terms and phrases. I will then explore federal laws and policies and recent updates. I will discuss in detail 2 different documents to be used for requesting meal modifications. These include the request for meal accommodation and medical statement forms that have been developed by the Nebraska Department of Education Nutrition Services. I will also spend time describing common requests and the appropriate actions for each. Before getting into the details of policy and law, it is important to understand why accommodating meals is significant. As food service professionals, you want to feed students nutritious and well-balanced meals so they may succeed in school. You also want to ensure the safety and health of each and every student. And ultimately, you want to provide an equal opportunity for students to participate in the school meal programs. All 3 of these reasons drive home the need for making meal modifications. Now that we have established that making meal modifications is very important for the success of a student, what are the parameters in order to make these accommodations? This is where the law, policy, and federal guidance comes in. The 3 most recent pieces of guidance have been published in the last 2 years. These publications play a large role in how SFAs can accommodate for meal modification requests. With each publication that comes out, more clarification has been made and updates have been included. The first piece of guidance is called SP 59-2016, or also known as the Policy Memorandum on Modifications to Accommodate Disabilities in the School Meal Programs. This memo incorporated the Americans with Disabilities Act's definition of disabilities, indicating that SFAs should make reasonable meal accommodations at no extra charge for students with restrictive or modified diets. The second piece of guidance is called SP 26-2017, also known as Accommodating Disabilities in the School Meal Programs, Guidance and Questions and Answers. This Q&A covers common questions that were raised following the release of SP 59-2016. It answers questions on how to ensure all students have access to the school meal programs. Accommodating Children with Disabilities in the School Meal Programs, Guidance for School Food Service Professionals, is the third and last piece of guidance I will mention today. It was released July 25, 2017, and is meant to supplement SP 59-2016 and SP 26-2017. At the very end of this guidance manual, there is a thorough list of additional outside resources that may be helpful to you. Now, each of these 3 documents that I have discussed are great resources if you have specific questions for certain meal modifications. I recommend everyone read through this new 2017 guidance as seen on display right now, as it answers many questions and emphasizes recent updates. So what are those updates that I've been talking about? I am briefly going to outline the main points here. The first main point is an emphasis being put on SFAs notifying families of the process for requesting meal modifications, and also identifying the responsible individual at the school for receiving this information. Schools may post notices in school publications, in radio announcements, and other relevant forms of media. The second main point focuses on the definition of disability. Policy memos prior to the 2017 guidance focused on accommodating for students that had a life-threatening disability. But the definition of disability has been expanded and no longer needs to be life-threatening in order for SFAs to make modifications. It is expected that most requests be accommodated as long as the need is based on a mental or physical impairment. These updates will be important to keep in mind as we continue through this training. When it comes to meal modification requests, there is some language to be familiar with. I will only be discussing the 5 terms and phrases found on this slide. If you have questions about additional terminology, please leave your question in the chat box. The first term is disability. Disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. With this expanded definition, more meal accommodations can be made. The definition of disability talks about major life activities, but what does that all entail? A major life activity may include anything that limits a person from taking care of oneself or alters how someone can see, hear, speak, read, think, etc. A major life activity also includes anything that limits bodily functions such as the immune, digestive, endocrine systems, etc. You can see a longer list here on this slide. Now, although this slide includes many ways major life activities may be impacted, this list is not limiting. There may be major life activities that are not on this list, and because of this, you are encouraged to assess each situation as a unique request. Another common phrase to be familiar with is food intolerance. Food intolerance is an abnormal response to a component of a food that does not involve an immune system reaction. In other words, a food intolerance is not life-threatening, but commonly causes discomfort, especially with the digestive system. If symptomatic foods are eaten, the person may experience abdominal pain, bloating, gas, or diarrhea. The most common types of intolerances you may encounter revolve around gluten and lactose. Gluten intolerances have to do with the consumption of wheat, barley, or rye. Lactose intolerances have to do with the consumption of dairy products. Next up is food allergies. A food allergy is an immune system reaction to a component of a food, at times producing a life-threatening response. This means that the body's response to an allergen may be life-threatening, but not necessarily always. Whether that allergen is life-threatening or not, it is of the utmost importance to keep students safe and healthy. About 90% of all food allergies fall within what's called the Big 8. The Big 8 includes allergens such as peanuts, tree nuts, which may include walnuts, almonds, pecans, cashews, etc., milk, eggs, wheat, soy, fish, which may include things such as tuna, carp, salmon, cod, etc., and shellfish, such as shrimp, crab, lobster, and many others. All of these allergens can be found in many other forms or under different names. It's important to know all the forms and names of an allergen because even the smallest amounts can cause an allergic reaction. Although a majority of food allergies fall within these 8 categories, food allergies are not limited to this list. You may potentially come across food allergies to kiwi, beef, corn, spices, among many, many other types of foods. If someone is exposed to an allergen, they may experience adverse health effects. The person may develop hives, itching, or skin rashes. They may also experience swelling of the lips, face, tongue, or throat. They may start wheezing, develop nasal congestion, or experience trouble breathing. They can develop abdominal pain, diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting. They can become dizzy, lightheaded, or faint. And a person with a food allergy will likely experience several of the above symptoms and potentially other symptoms that are not listed here. Be sure to communicate with the household and other school staff so everyone knows what to expect and the correct actions to take if a reaction should occur. Although it is important to know the signs and symptoms of an allergic reaction, the best defense is to prevent the allergic reaction from occurring in the first place. In order to prevent adverse reactions, there are many proactive things you can do. First, you should know each student and understand what their exact needs are. If you feel a meal modification request is unclear, be sure to reach out to the household and/or the school nurse to try to clear any confusion. Having a strong understanding of a student's situation is of utmost importance in order to prepare foods correctly. You are also encouraged to use standardized recipes. If you are using standardized recipes, you ensure that the same ingredients and amounts are being used every time the recipe is made. This can prevent any unexpected ingredients from making it into the food. Another important piece of safety is to prevent cross-contamination through good food safety practices. This will help prevent allergens from crossing from one food to the next. This will also help prevent the spread of any illnesses that potentially could be carried by food, thus protecting all of your student population. It's also important to be willing to work with others. Call the household if clarification about the diet is needed. Discuss the student's meal plan with your coworkers in the kitchen. Reach out to the school nurse, etc. Open communication between individuals is important to keep a student safe and healthy. And finally, know how to read nutrition facts labels. Be familiar with the setup of a label and what items and terms to look for. If you are unsure if a food item contains a specific allergen or not, it is your responsibility to contact your distributor or manufacturer to make that determination. Being proactive with nutrition facts labels will prevent you from ordering foods that contain an allergen. If you are looking for more information on food allergies and other health conditions, you can click on or type the following link into your browser. The National Food Service Management Institute has much food and nutrition information that is organized into various fact sheets. The next common phrase is celiac disease. Celiac disease is the immune reaction from gluten that occurs in the small intestine, causing abdominal pain, bloating, or diarrhea. Although this reaction sounds similar to an allergy, it is something quite different. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disease that causes damage in the small intestine and prevents the person from absorbing nutrients effectively. It is essential that these individuals avoid gluten-containing grains, such as wheat, barley, and rye, which is the same treatment for gluten intolerance. By avoiding these grains, we can make sure that a student is healthy, safe, and are absorbing important nutrients. The last phrase is state-licensed healthcare professional. This is an individual who is authorized to write medical prescription under state law. These individuals may include a physician, physician's assistant, advanced practice registered nurse practitioner, chiropractor, or licensed medical nutrition therapist that is working in conjunction with a licensed physician. Now, although we only discussed 5 different phrases, there are many other definitions you may want to look up if you have any questions. Additional definitions can be found at the back of Accommodating Children with Disabilities in the School Meal Programs, Guidance for School Food Service Professionals, which is the piece of guidance that just came out in 2017. Now that we have some common language in our back pocket, we can now talk about meal modification requests and forms. SFAs are to make reasonable meal accommodations for students with mental or physical impairments. What deems a reasonable meal accommodation is to be determined by your SFA. Because SFAs are encouraged to provide meal modification, open communication is key to keep students safe and encourage participation in the school meal programs. The request for meal accommodation and medical statement forms are meant to be a documented form of communication between the student, the parents or guardians, and the SFA. The request for meal accommodation form can be seen on the left, and the medical statement form can be seen on the right. We will discuss each of these forms in detail. This first form is called Request for Meal Accommodation. This is to be completed by the student or parent or guardian when requesting modifications that fall within the program meal pattern. For example, this form could be utilized if a student has an allergy to a single fruit or vegetable, such as strawberries. In this case, the SFA would simply offer the student another fruit in place of the strawberries. To fill out this form, the student or parent or guardian will need to provide the student's information. This information includes the student's name, date of birth, the name of the parent guardian, and the school building the student attends. Several different forms of communication with the household are also requested, such as a telephone number, address, and email address. In the next section, it is requested that the type of dietary restrictions or modifications be described. Following that, a description of the physical or mental impairment needs to be listed. It is not required that a medical diagnosis be included. Only a description is required. The bottom half of the form includes the civil rights statement that protects individuals from discrimination. This statement includes contact information for individuals to request accommodations or to file a complaint of discrimination. A few examples of discriminatory actions may include providing an individual an opportunity that is not equal to the opportunity provided to others, or providing an individual services that are not as effective as the services provided to others, or denying an individual the opportunity to benefit from or participate in aids, benefits, or services granted to them. These three examples really drive home the importance of providing meal accommodations to students with specific diet needs. As food service professionals, you want to ensure that all students have the same opportunities to eat nutritious and well-balanced meals as other students do. In the bottom right corner is a box that the SFA is to complete. The school should indicate who the form can be returned to, their phone number, the date the form was received back at the SFA, and a spot to indicate if and when the school made a follow-up with the family. It is recommended that the SFA follow up with the family at least once a year to ensure the information is up to date. By federal regulation, this form is not required if accommodations can be met within program meal pattern. However, there must be some form of documentation regarding a meal modification request. Nutrition Services strongly encourages SFAs to utilize this form as a communication tool. The second form is the medical statement. This is to be used if meal accommodations cannot be made within the program meal pattern. An example of this might be a student's family requesting a gluten-free diet due to celiac disease. Gluten-free products are not always whole grain rich, and because of this, these meals would not fall within meal pattern, thus requiring a medical statement. The medical statement requires the same student information and contact information as the request for meal accommodation form. This form also requires a description for the physical or mental impairment and any dietary restrictions or modifications. Again, a medical diagnosis is not required to be listed. Foods to omit and foods to substitute can be listed, if applicable. There is also a section to indicate if texture or thickness modifications are needed. With a medical statement on file, an SFA can be reimbursed for meal modifications outside the program meal pattern. On this form, there is a space for the signature of a state licensed medical professional, their printed name and title, contact information, and date the document was signed. This form may also be signed by a practicing licensed medical nutrition therapist, along with the name of the physician they are working with. Similar to the request for meal accommodation form, the civil rights statement is found on the bottom half of the document, and the school's information section can be found on the bottom right. A key point to remember as you receive meal modification requests is each student has their own individualized needs. With that said, each request needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you have questions about a request or need clarification, reach out to the student's parents or guardians. Open communication between the household and the SFA helps encourage participation in the school meal program and also promotes safety of the student. Another key point. An SFA should not delay a meal modification if a medical statement is not yet on file. Modification should be made as soon as possible in order to keep the student safe and healthy. The SFA should continually follow up with the household until a medical statement is provided. Documentation is to be kept on file each time the household is contacted for follow-up on receiving said documentation. Both the request for meal accommodation and medical statement forms can be found on NDE's website at the following link. A Spanish version of the medical statement will also be available on the website soon. Once you receive the completed forms, how long do you keep them on file? Record retention is an important part of the school meal programs, and documenting meal modifications is no different. For those students that are currently part of the school district, keep the documentation on file for as long as the student attends your school. Be sure to make follow-up calls at least once a year to keep information up to date. For those students who are part of your school and no longer need meal modifications, keep that documentation on file for 3 years plus the current year. This is the same time frame for any other documentation pertaining to the school meal programs. As far as reimbursement goes, SFAs can claim meals for reimbursement when modifications are made within meal pattern and modifications that are made outside a meal pattern that have supporting documentation, such as the medical statement. There is no additional reimbursement for any extra costs accrued for providing meal accommodations. Offer versus serve. Offer versus serve gives students more control in the foods they choose to take and eat. Offer versus serve may help reduce food waste and even encourage students to try new foods. With offer versus serve, a student can create a reimbursable meal without taking all 5 components. In the case of meal modifications, a student cannot be asked to exclude a food component. This would not be considered a reasonable modification and could not be claimed for reimbursement. The student must still be offered all 5 components. If a student cannot have a food component being offered, the SFA is expected to offer a reasonable substitution for that component. Even if the student does not take the component offered, the option still needs to be available to them. For example, you have a student needing a gluten-free diet, and you are serving hamburgers on a bun one day. Best practice would be to offer the student a gluten-free bun or equivalent to go with their hamburger. The student cannot be asked not to take a bun because a gluten-free option is not available. Gluten-free options should be available to the student every day. As I have previously emphasized, SFAs must take requests on a case-by-case basis because each request will be unique. That said, requests can cover a wide spectrum of scenarios. I will cover some basics of the more common requests you might receive. Peanut allergies are a fairly common food modification request. Because this allergy is so common, some schools have decided to create peanut-safe tables in the lunchroom, or have even gone as far as making the entire school peanut-safe. Be careful with the verbiage if your SFA would like to go this route. You cannot have a peanut-free table or school. The SFA can ensure the products going through the kitchen are peanut-free, but we cannot ensure that all outside food coming into the SFA is absolutely peanut-free. Thus, the SFA can advertise as peanut-safe, but not peanut-free. Another meal modification request you might receive revolves around portion sizes. An SFA may come across a meal request that would fall under or over the minimum portion sizes for the school meal program's meal pattern. Whether for small portions or larger portions, the request must be verified with a medical statement signed by a licensed healthcare professional. If the SFA is accommodating for larger portion sizes, the SFA will not receive additional reimbursement from the school meal programs to cover extra costs. To cover these costs, the SFA may use funds from the school food service account, general fund account, or special education funds if it is specified in the student's individualized education plan, or otherwise known as an IEP. Another meal modification request an SFA might receive is to serve a specific brand name item. In this case, it would be verified with a medical statement in order for the SFA to provide the brand name product. It is recommended that the SFA follow up with the household to determine if the brand name product is the only product that can be served, or if certain generic brands may be equivalent to those brand name items. Many times, the generic brand will be sufficient. Some households may request meal accommodations based on preferences. These requests may be based on cultural, religious, or ethnic backgrounds. SFAs are not required to accommodate for meal preferences, although providing accommodations may help participation in school meal programs. SFAs are strongly encouraged to consider making accommodations, even if it is as simple as providing more information on monthly menus. The SFA may choose to indicate meals that have pork in them. You may indicate foods that are vegetarian or foods that may contain milk, soy, or egg products. The SFA can adapt the menu information depending on what the needs of the student population are. Any meal modifications made based on preference must fall within meal pattern. SFAs are responsible for any additional costs accrued from making such accommodations. Milk is by far the most common accommodation requested. The request may be based on preference or it may be deemed medically necessary. Again, if the request is a cultural, religious, or ethnic preference, the SFA is not required to accommodate, but encouraged to consider the request. If the request is based on a mental or physical impairment, the SFA is expected to make accommodations. Some cases may be accommodated within meal pattern and do not require a medical statement. A good example of this would be providing lactose-free milk for a student with a lactose intolerance. In other cases, a medical statement may be required. An example of this might be when a family is requesting almond milk to be served to a student. In this case, almond milk would not be nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk and would fall outside the program meal pattern. This particular request would require a medical statement signed by a licensed healthcare provider, indicating that the almond milk is the appropriate substitution for that student. With the medical statement on file, the SFA is required to provide the student almond milk. As I briefly mentioned in the previous slide, milk alternates must be nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk. In this chart is listed the nutrients and their minimum amounts required in order for a milk alternate to meet the nutrient requirements. The required nutrients to be present in milk alternates are calcium, protein, vitamin A, vitamin D, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, riboflavin, and vitamin B12. The only exception to this rule would be if a medical statement is on file indicating an alternate milk that does not meet the minimum nutrient requirements. Water and juice are never acceptable substitutions for milk. We are now approaching the end of the webinar and have acquired much information. Let's take that information and apply it to some realistic scenarios. Some of these examples have been taken and adapted from the USDA's guidance manual or policy memos. Example 1. A parent calls and requests a gluten-free diet. Do you encourage the parent to complete a request for meal accommodation or medical statement form? I mentioned this example a little earlier in this session. In this case, I would encourage the family to complete a medical statement. Many times gluten-free items are not whole grain rich and because of this would not fall within meal pattern. A medical statement will also allow an SFA to claim the student's meals for reimbursement. On to example 2. Is an SFA required to make meal modifications for food preferences rather than for a physical or mental impairment? No. SFAs are not required to provide meal modifications for preference requests, although it is strongly encouraged that the SFA consider making accommodations. Making preference modifications may help with participation in the school meal programs. Just remember that if you would choose to make modification based on preference, the modification must fall within meal pattern. And example number 3. A student no longer requires modified meals outside the program meal pattern. Must an SFA obtain an amended medical statement prior to ending the student's meal modification? No. An SFA would not need a new medical statement. The SFA is encouraged to follow up with the family and ensure that the student no longer needs the modification. Documenting this interaction on the medical statement you currently have and keeping this information on file for 3 years plus the current year. This information will be beneficial to have on hand in case the student ever needs meal modifications in the future. It's time to start wrapping everything we've learned. The main points we discussed today include the following. First, providing meal accommodations are important for students' health, safety, and participation in the school meal programs. Second, federal laws and guidance can help us determine how to accommodate for meal modification requests. Because of the new guidance, NDE Nutrition Services has created requests for meal accommodation and medical statement forms to help with communication between the household and the SFA. And finally, there is potential for many different modifications to be requested. Most importantly, each request should be individualized to ensure the student is properly cared for. This presentation was created utilizing these resources. Again, I encourage you to read through the new guidance manual. There's a lot of great meal modification information included. The guidance may even help you answer some of your questions. Would you like to learn more about meal modifications and diet requests? Feel welcome to jump over to watch Team Nutrition's online Moodle trainings. Just click the link on the PowerPoint slide or type the link into your web browser search bar. This link will take you to a page that has several school meal program trainings listed. If you see any other trainings that you think might be beneficial to watch, please do so. To specifically learn more about meal modifications and diet requests, click on Working with Special Diet Students. Moodle will then prompt you to log in, and if you already have an account, go ahead and log in. If not, you can create a free account in just a few minutes. After getting signed in, Moodle will then display 3 separate training videos you can watch. These videos will not include the recent updates that we talked about today, but have so much valuable information in them. The first video discusses the basics of meal modification. It talks about why we need to provide modifications, who might need these modifications, and how to make the modifications. The second video focuses on food allergens, reading food labels, and substituting menu items. And finally, the third video provides information on celiac disease and gluten-free diets. If you do have additional questions that have not been discussed during this session today, please contact Nutrition Services through our direct line or toll-free line. My email can also be found at the beginning of this training. You may also visit the Nutrition Services Special Diet webpage. The webpage has additional information that you may find useful in your food service operation. Later this week, you will be notified that the recording of this webinar, the PowerPoint slides, and a certificate of completion that's worth 1 CEU are posted to the NDE website and available to you. And I encourage you to ask questions into the chat box or email me again. I will now open this webinar to any questions we can address at this moment. I may not get to all your questions today, but we'll document them and get back to you with an answer. Potentially, we will develop an FAQ sheet that will be created and provided to you at a later date. Do we have any questions? Okay. And at the moment, we do not have any questions, so I will go ahead and end this webinar. Again, please feel free to reach out to me at any point in time. Thank you.